Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. The blades of the helicopter sliced through the crisp suburban air, sending a powerful gust across the neatly trimmed lawns of the Willow Creek gated community. Jack Reynolds, a U.S. Senator, exhaled deeply as he brought his private chopper down onto the massive backyard of his own home. It had been a grueling week in Washington, filled with back-to-back meetings, heated debates, and enough political nonsense to drive anyone insane. All he wanted now was a quiet weekend in his luxurious estate, sipping whiskey, enjoying a steak, and spending time with his family. But as the engine powered down and the dust settled, trouble was already brewing. The moment Jack stepped out of the helicopter, a shrill voice pierced through the peaceful evening air. Karen Thompson, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, came marching toward him, her arms flailing like she was conducting an invisible orchestra of outrage. Her perfectly styled blonde bob was bouncing with every furious step she took, and her expensive but slightly outdated pantsuit looked ready to burst at the seams with the sheer force of her indignation. "Absolutely unacceptable," she screeched, pointing a manicured finger at Jack, as if he had just committed a war crime. "You cannot land a helicopter here. This is a residential neighborhood, not an airport." Jack sighed, already regretting his decision to return home. He pulled off his aviator sunglasses and gave her a measured look, debating whether to dignify her tantrum with a response. Unfortunately, Karen never required a response to continue her monologues. "This is a blatant violation of HOA rules," she continued, stomping closer. "There are strict guidelines about noise levels, air pollution, and property values, and this," she waved her arms at the sleek, multi-million-dollar helicopter behind him, "is bringing down the integrity of our community." Jack ran a hand through his graying hair and crossed his arms. "Karen, this is my property. I own it. And last I checked, I'm also a U.S. Senator, which means I have access to legal experts who would love to go over your so-called guidelines with a fine-tooth comb." Karen's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She was not a woman used to being challenged. The HOA had long operated under the rule of fear, controlling residents with an iron fist wrapped in bureaucracy. But Jack wasn't just another suburban homeowner too afraid to push back. He was a man who had spent decades battling political adversaries far more ruthless than Karen Thompson. "Well," she huffed, adjusting the gaudy pearl necklace strangling her throat, "rules are rules. The HOA has full authority to prohibit unauthorized aircraft landings within the community." Jack let out a short laugh, one that only made Karen's face twitch in irritation. "And when exactly was that rule made?" he asked. "Because I read the HOA bylaws when I bought this house, and I don't recall anything about helicopters." Karen's eyes darted left and right as if she, searching for backup. "It's an unspoken rule," she declared, "a matter of common sense and respect for the neighborhood." "Unspoken rules don't hold up in court," Jack shot back. "And since you're so concerned about common sense, let me clarify something. The FAA regulations supersede any HOA restrictions when it comes to private airspace usage on private property, which means legally my helicopter is no different from a car parked in my driveway." Karen's face flushed a deep shade of crimson, but before she could respond, a few neighbors had begun to step out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some whispered among themselves, smirking at the unfolding scene, while others stood frozen, afraid of angering the HOA tyrant. "You will be fine," Karen finally spat, her voice rising to a new level of hysteria. "And I will be calling an emergency HOA meeting to formally ban all aircraft from the community." Jack stared at her for a moment, then shook his head in disbelief. "Karen, I literally write laws for a living," he said, exasperation clear in his voice. "Do you honestly think you can out-legislate a sitting senator?" But Karen was too far gone in her crusade. She whirled around and stomped off, her heels clicking furiously against the pavement. "You'll regret this," she called over her shoulder. "The HOA has more power than you think." Jack exhaled slowly as he watched her disappear into her house, no doubt to gather her minions for another HOA dictatorship session. He turned to his wife, who had been watching from the porch with an amused expression. "So," she said, tilting her head, "that went well." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "I just wanted a quiet weekend," he muttered, "but now I guess I'm at war." That night, as he sat in his study nursing a glass of whiskey, his phone buzzed. A message from one of his neighbors flashed across the screen. It was a forwarded email from the HOA. Urgent HOA meeting, discussion of immediate helicopter ban. Jack smirked. Karen was predictable, if nothing else. Fine, if she wanted to fight, she was going to get one, he thought. But what she failed to realize was that she wasn't just messing with some helpless homeowner. She was messing with a man who had spent his entire career crushing bureaucratic nonsense. And when it came to politics, Jack Reynolds never lost. With a final sip of his drink, he leaned back in his chair and smiled to himself. Let the games begin. Jack arrived at the HOA meeting prepared for battle. The conference room inside the community center was filled with homeowners, most of them seated with blank expressions, already resigned to whatever absurd decree Karen was about to push through. At the front of the room, Karen stood tall with a smug expression, holding a thick binder in one hand and a gavel in the other, as if she were presiding over the Supreme Court instead of a suburban neighborhood meeting. As soon as Jack took a seat near the back, Karen dramatically cleared her throat and began, "Good evening, everyone. I have called this emergency meeting because of an urgent, an important and deeply concerning issue threatens the integrity of our beloved community." She paused for effect, her beady eyes scanning the room, waiting for someone to nod in agreement. Yesterday, an unauthorized helicopter landed within our neighborhood, violating multiple HOA regulations and creating a serious safety hazard. Therefore, I am proposing an immediate permanent ban on all aircraft within Willow Creek. A murmur spread through the room, but no one looked particularly outraged. Most people were there out of obligation, hoping to get out before Karen found a way to fine them for something trivial, like parking 1 inch too far from the curb. Jack crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, waiting for his turn to speak. Karen continued, flipping through the pages in her binder. As you all know, the HOA exists to protect the value of our properties and maintain the peaceful nature of our community. Helicopters, as I'm sure we can all agree, do not belong in a residential area. They are loud, disruptive, and frankly an eyesore. She snapped the binder shut. "I'm calling for a vote. All those in favor of banning helicopters," said. Before anyone could process what was happening, Karen's small group of loyal supporters, mostly other HOA board members who lived in fear of her wrath, immediately shouted their approval. The rest of the room barely had time to react before Karen slammed the gavel down. "The motion is passed," she declared triumphantly, as if she had just negotiated world peace. Jack exhaled sharply through his nose and stood up. "That was fast," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I have a few questions before you go making up new rules." Karen turned toward him with an icy glare. "Senator Reynolds, as a member of this community, you are welcome to voice your concerns. However, the decision has already been made." Jack ignored her and pulled out his phone. "That's interesting because I just checked the original HOA bylaws, and there is nothing about aircraft bans anywhere in the official regulations. You can't enforce a rule you just made up on the spot." Karen narrowed her eyes, but Jack continued. "And more importantly, the Federal Aviation Administration has jurisdiction over private airspace, meaning any restriction you try to put in place is completely meaningless." He looked directly at her, watching her expression shift from confidence to frustration. "So legally, my helicopter is no different than a car parked in my driveway. Your little vote doesn't change anything." The room fell silent. Some homeowners exchanged glances, realizing for the first time that maybe, just maybe, Karen wasn't the ultimate authority she claimed to be. Karen, however, was not one to accept defeat so easily. She forced a smile and crossed her arms. "The HOA has every right to enforce neighborhood standards, Senator. If we determine that helicopters disrupt the harmony of our community, then we have the power to restrict them." Jack shook his head. "You don't have that power, Karen. The FAA regulations override any HOA rules. Rule: I can land my helicopter on my property whenever I want, and there's nothing you can do about it. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. We will see about that, she snapped. You might be used to pushing people around in Washington, but I run this community. Jack smirked. That's cute, but I deal with people way scarier than you on a daily basis. You're not even in the top 10. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling for air, but before she could respond, someone in the back of the room chuckled. The sound spread quickly, and soon several homeowners were laughing quietly, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. Karen's grip on her gavel tightened. If that's how you want to play it, she said through gritted teeth, then fine. I will be filing formal complaints against you for violating noise ordinances, safety hazards, and any other violations I can find. Jack raised an eyebrow. Filing them with who exactly? The same police department that I work with regularly. The same officials who already know my helicopter is legally permitted. Karen's confidence faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. This isn't over, she hissed before turning on her heel and storming out of the meeting, leaving her confused followers scrambling after her. Jack sighed and rubbed his temple. He had hoped she would take the legal facts and back off, but Karen was the type who thrived on power. She wasn't going to stop until she either won or was completely humiliated. As he walked out of the meeting, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant. Karen just filed a noise complaint against you with the city and submitted a request for an official inspection of your property. Apparently, you're now a safety risk to the entire community. Jack chuckled to himself. She was escalating. Good, that meant she was getting desperate. He climbed into his car, shaking his head. If Karen wanted a war, she had just officially started one. And Jack Reynolds never lost a war. Jack woke up the next morning to the sound of his wife laughing in the kitchen. He walked downstairs, still groggy, and found her leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone. When she noticed him, she turned the screen toward him, showing a neighborhood group chat flooded with messages. The entire HOA was buzzing with Karen's latest stunt. Apparently, she had gone door to door warning people about the dangerous helicopter in their community, claiming it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. She even spread a rumor that Jack's helicopter was part of some deep government surveillance operation spying on the residents of Willow Creek. Jack sighed as he poured himself a cup of coffee. She's really leaning into the paranoia, his wife remarked. Oh, it gets better. She's organizing a Protect Our Community protest in front of our house this afternoon. Jack nearly spit out his coffee. She's what? She's rallying the HOA board and some of the more gullible residents to come stand on our property. Lawn with signs, she said, shaking her head. I swear, this woman has too much free time. Jack set his mug down and rubbed his temples. All right, I'll let her embarrass herself for a little while. Then I'll remind her again that she's picking a fight she can't win. Later that afternoon, Jack stood at his office window watching as a small but determined group of HOA loyalists gathered in front of his house. Karen, of course, stood front and center, waving a poorly made sign that read no to noise pollution. Another neighbor held up a sign that said, Respect our peace, while an older woman clutched one that simply said, Save the children. Jack's phone buzzed. It was a text from his neighbor Greg, a retired firefighter who had never been a fan of Karen's antics. Your fan club is here. Should I bring popcorn? Jack chuckled and replied, Give it 5 minutes. She'll be screaming. He stepped outside, hand in his pockets, as Karen turned to face him with all the theatrics of a woman who thought she was leading a revolution. Senator Reynolds, she called, voice full of fake authority. On behalf of the residents of Willow Creek, we demand that you remove your helicopter and respect the peace of this neighborhood. Jack looked around at the small crowd, then back at Karen. Respect the peace? You're the one standing on my lawn with a megaphone. Karen's face twitched. This is a peaceful protest. Jack glanced at Greg, who was sitting on his porch watching the whole thing unfold like a primetime comedy show. You hear that, Greg? They're peacefully trespassing. Greg grinned. Sure looks that way. Karen's nostrils flared. We are within our rights to protest. This is about the safety and comfort of our community. Karen, you can stand out here all day holding signs, but it won't change the fact that my helicopter is legal. Your little rule doesn't override federal law. Karen took a step forward, lowering her voice. You may have your fancy government connections, but I have something you don't. Jack raised an eyebrow. Common sense? Community support, she hissed. These people trust me. They believe in protecting their homes. And if I say your helicopter is a threat, they'll believe me. Jack crossed his arms. So you're just making things up now? You're telling people I'm endangering the community when I haven't broken a single law. Karen smirked. Public opinion matters more than laws. And in this neighborhood, I control public opinion. Jack stared at her for a moment before shaking his head. Karen, you're about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you push too far. Karen scoffed. Well, please, what are you going to do? Sue the HOA. Jack smirked. No, but I do have a few friends in high places who love dealing with petty bureaucrats like you. Karen's smug expression faltered for just a second before she quickly masked it. This isn't over, she snapped before turning to her protesters. We will continue our fight against noise pollution and government overreach. We will not back down. Jack sighed and walked back. Into his house, shaking his head, his wife was waiting in the foyer, arms crossed. So how did that go? She thinks she's winning. His wife rolled her eyes. She's delusional, she is. Jack took out his phone and made a call. Hey, I need a favor. Someone's trying to play dirty with property regulations, and I think it's time for some legal education. The next morning, a city inspector arrived at Karen's house, clipboard in hand. She answered the door in her robe, still half asleep. Mrs. Thompson, the inspector said, we received several complaints about unauthorized modifications on your property. We'll need to conduct an inspection. Karen's eyes widened. What? That's ridiculous. Who complained? I can't disclose that, the inspector said, flipping through his notes. But according to our records, your backyard fence is 3 inches higher than regulation. Your deck wasn't properly permitted, and your front lawn decorations exceed the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. Karen spluttered, That's absurd. My fence has been here for years. The inspector shrugged. And yet, here we are. By noon, Karen was on the verge of a meltdown. She had spent the entire morning arguing with the city inspector, and by the time he left, she had a list of violations she needed to fix immediately. That was when she realized something was very, very wrong. Jack watched from across the street as Karen paced back and forth, yelling into her phone. Greg walked over and chuckled. You did this, didn't you? Jack smirked. I have no idea what you're talking about. Greg shook his head. She's unraveling. She brought this on herself. Jack said, taking a sip of his coffee, she wanted to play dirty. Now she gets to see what happens when you pick a fight with the wrong person. Greg laughed. I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Jack nodded. Oh, it is. Karen thinks she's at war with me. She doesn't realize she's already lost. Karen spent the next 2 days in full panic mode. The city inspector had given her an official notice outlining every violation her property had, and the fines were piling up fast. She had spent years enforcing strict rules on others, but now that the spotlight was on her, she wasn't handling it well. Every time Jack saw her, she was on the phone arguing with someone, gesturing wildly, and pacing back and forth in front of her house. She had called an emergency HOA board meeting, but this time, not everyone was rallying behind her. Jack arrived at the community center early, taking a seat near the back. Again, Karen was already there, standing at the front with her usual gavel and an expression that was quickly losing its authority. She looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days, and the HOA board members beside her were shifting uncomfortably, looking less like loyal followers and more like people who didn't want to be associated with a sinking ship. Karen cleared her throat, trying to maintain her usual commanding presence. We are here today to discuss the ongoing violations occurring in our community. It has come to my attention that outside forces are interfering with our ability to enforce regulations, and I believe we must take action to protect the integrity of the HOA. Jack smirked. By outside forces, you mean the actual city officials who are enforcing real laws? The same ones you've been bending to your advantage for years? Karen shot him a glare. Senator Reynolds, this meeting is not about personal disputes. It is about maintaining order. Jack leaned back in his chair. Oh, I think it's very much about personal disputes. You see, Karen, You spent so much time trying to punish me for something that wasn't illegal, and now the law is actually coming after you for things that are. Karen slammed her gavel down. This is harassment. You're using your political power to target me. Jack chuckled. No, Karen, I didn't file those reports. I didn't even have to. Turns out, when you spend years bullying people with unnecessary fines and threats, they tend to remember. All I did was remind a few neighbors that they had every right to request inspections on suspicious properties. The rest? That was all you. A murmur spread through the room. Some of the homeowners nodded in agreement. Over the years, Karen had fined people for mailbox colors, grass height, and even for having the wrong shade of curtains visible from the street. Nobody had ever fought back before, but now that they saw Karen could be held accountable, the fear was starting to wear off. One of the board members, an older man named Richard, cleared his throat. Karen, we need to be realistic here. The fines on your property alone are enough to bankrupt the HOA's emergency funds. If we try to cover them, Karen turned to him, stunned. You're not suggesting we let them stand? Richard adjusted his glasses. We don't have a choice. You've spent years making sure every little rule was enforced, and now that those same rules are being applied to you, we can't just change them. Jack watched Karen's face twist in frustration. She was losing control, and she knew it. She had built her power on the idea that nobody would dare challenge her. But now not only was she being challenged, she was being abandoned. Karen straightened her back. If the board will not support me, I will take legal action. I will fight this in court. Jack sighed. You don't have a case, Karen. And even if you did, do you really think you can afford a legal battle? You're already drowning in fines. And last I checked, your HOA salary isn't exactly paying for high-powered attorneys. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she had nothing to say. The meeting ended without a resolution, but the damage was done. By the time Karen stormed out, the board was already murmuring about replacing her. Jack knew it wouldn't be long before she lost her position entirely. The next day, Jack received a call from his legal team. Looks like Karen made one last desperate move, his lawyer said. She tried to push through an emergency order to have you forcibly removed from the neighborhood. Jack laughed. I'm guessing it didn't work? Not even close. The judge dismissed it before it even got anywhere. But here's the fun part. Since she misused HOA funds to file the claim, she's now under investigation for financial misconduct. Jack grinned. That's the cherry on top. Later that evening, Jack sat on his back patio, sipping a drink as the sun set over his estate. His helicopter sat exactly where it belonged, untouched and completely legal. From his vantage point, he could see Karen's house, where she was furiously pacing inside. A moving truck was parked in her driveway. Greg walked over, sipping a beer. So, I hear Karen's selling her house. Jack nodded. She doesn't have a choice. The fines, the legal fees, and now the HOA board turning on her, she's done. Greg let out a low whistle. You really outplayed her. Jack shrugged. She played herself. I just let her. A few days later, Jack received an official letter from the HOA. Karen had been voted out as president. A new board was being assembled, and there was even talk of revising some of the more ridiculous rules she had put in place. The final blow came when Karen's house finally sold, and Jack made one last move to ensure her legacy would never be forgotten. He bought it. The day Karen moved out, Jack watched as she loaded the last of her things into a car. She shot him one final glare before speeding away, leaving behind the community she had ruled over for years. Greg stood beside Jack, shaking his head. You really bought her house? Jack sipped his drink. I did. What are you going to do with it? Jack smirked. Oh, I have plans. 2 weeks later, a fresh sign was installed on the front lawn, Karen Memorial Landing Pad. Greg burst out laughing. You're evil. Jack grinned. She should have known better than to pick a fight with me. Jack stood on his back patio, watching as the last traces of Karen's reign over Willow Creek disappeared. Her moving truck had long since pulled away, and the neighborhood felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from every homeowner's shoulders. For years, she had controlled this place like a dictator, but now she was nothing more than a bad memory. The HOA board had been completely reshuffled, And for the first time in a long time, residents were no longer afraid of being fined for ridiculous things like mailbox colors or grass length. The absurdity of it all made Jack chuckle. Karen had spent years bending and abusing rules, only to be crushed by those same rules when they were applied to her. Greg walked up to Jack with a cold beer in hand, shaking his head as he glanced over at the newly installed sign in Karen's old front yard. The bold engraved letters read, Karen Memorial Landing Pad, and the sight of it still sent Greg into fits of laughter. Jack had wasted no time after purchasing the house, clearing the backyard and turning it into an actual helicopter landing zone just to drive the final nail into Karen's legacy. It was poetic justice at its finest. Greg said, taking a sip of his beer, I don't think she's ever going to recover from this. Words already spread all over the city. She's a punchline now. Jack smirked. That's what happens when you make yourself the villain of your own story. People love to watch a tyrant fall. Greg chuckled. So what's next? You taking over the HOA entirely? Jack shook his head. Oh, I don't need that kind of headache. But I did agree to sit in as an advisor just to make sure the new board doesn't get any Karen-like ideas. Greg grinned. So you're keeping them in check? Exactly, Jack said. No more ridiculous rules. No more harassment. People should be able to live in their own homes without worrying about whether their flower pots are the wrong shade of beige. Later that evening, Jack received a text from one of the new HOA board members. They wanted him to attend the first official meeting under the new leadership. He wasn't particularly eager to spend another evening in a room full of HOA discussions. But this time, it was different. This time, the meeting wasn't about power grabs or absurd restrictions. It was about fixing what had been broken. He arrived at the community center to find a completely different atmosphere. Gone was the heavy tension that always lingered whenever Karen ran a meeting. The homeowners who had once cowered in fear of speaking up now seemed relaxed, engaged, and even excited about the changes being proposed. The new board members were discussing plans to remove outdated fines, reduce unnecessary fees, and make the HOA about actually helping the community rather than controlling it. Jack sat back, listening, satisfied that things were finally moving in the right direction. At one point, Richard, the newly elected HOA president, turned to Jack with a smile. I have to say, Senator Reynolds, I never thought I'd see the day when an HOA meeting didn't feel like a courtroom trial. I think we all owe you for what you did. Jack waved a hand dismissively. I just gave Karen the one thing she never expected. Consequences. Richard laughed. Well, it worked. The board even voted on something special to commemorate the occasion. Jack raised an eyebrow. Oh, Richard gestured to another board member, who pulled out a framed certificate and set it in front of Jack. He glanced down, reading the words out loud. Official HOA approval. Senator Jack Reynolds' private helicopter landing zone. He burst out laughing. You've got to be kidding me. Richard grinned. Consider it our way of making sure no one ever tries to ban your helicopter again. Jack shook his head, chuckling as he leaned back in his chair. I have to admit, this is pretty satisfying. After the meeting, Jack walked home under the cool night sky, enjoying the peace and quiet. He passed by Karen's old house, now officially part of his property, and looked at the freshly installed helipad, complete with proper FAA approval and city permits. It was ironic how everything had come full circle. Karen had wanted nothing more than to control every aspect of, in this neighborhood, her old home served as a permanent reminder that her power was gone. Back at his own house, he found his wife waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of whiskey. She handed him one and sat beside him, looking out at the now peaceful street. So you won, she said, taking a sip. Jack smiled. I don't think it was ever a real competition. She laughed. That poor woman, she really thought she could beat you. Jack shook his head. She thought rules only applied to other people. That was her biggest mistake. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the evening air. Then, in the distance, the sound of an approaching helicopter filled the sky. Jack glanced up and grinned. A friend of his was stopping by for a visit. For the first time in weeks, he could land without anyone screaming about HOA violations. As the helicopter descended onto the newly established landing pad, Jack leaned back in his chair, watching as the dust swirled around the yard. The old Karen would have been losing her mind at the sight. He could almost hear her screeching and see her standing with her arms crossed, trying to throw out another ridiculous fine. But now there was nothing she could do. She was gone. Her reign was over. And Jack had made sure that the neighborhood would never be under the thumb of another HOA tyrant again. Greg wandered over from across the street, watching the helicopter touch down. You know, he said, shaking his head, I think this is the first time an HOA actually made a neighborhood better instead of worse. Jack grinned. There's a first time for everything. As the helicopter's engine powered down, Jack took another sip of his drink, feeling completely at peace. He had come home looking for a quiet weekend, but instead, he had ended up in a ridiculous war with the most stubborn HOA president in existence. Yet in the end, he had gotten exactly what he wanted: his home, his peace, and his helicopter sitting proudly on the very land Karen had once ruled over. He leaned back, exhaled, and smiled to himself. Nothing quite like the sweet smell of victory and jet fuel.